Welcome back to Prescription for Change, brought to you by Project Opioid. My name is Dr. Kendall Ward, and I'm here with Dr. Philip Toll from Aspire Health Partners. And we just real quick before we get started with our next guest, Dr. Phil, why don't you just tell us a little bit about if somebody's suffering right now, because again, we totally we've seen the data, we understand that there's so many people that are suffering right now and at potentially risk for overdose. So what does somebody in that situation in our community do?
It's important, Kendall, that people reach out to get the treatment and the assistance that they need and the support that they need in order to overcome the substance use disorder. And the best way to do that is through a full assessment through Aspire Health Partners. And you can reach Aspire Health Partners at 407-875-3700. When you get the auto attendant, just hit 3. For new clients, we'll go directly to someone who answers the phone, who can evaluate what their needs are and complete that assessment or direct them onto the level of care.
Great. And somebody can call that number anytime, right?
Yes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the important piece is that there's always hope. There's someone there waiting to assist you in addressing the issues and supporting you in this process of change.
Right. So if somebody's feeling isolated, maybe we've been quarantining, we've lost contact with our friends, maybe they're using a little more than they used to, and they're worried about themselves, or they're worried about a friend or a family member. This is the right way to go, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And even a family member reaching out for someone who may not yet quite be ready for treatment can get the guidance and assistance that they need in order to support that loved one who's using.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And we'll make sure to repeat that number back throughout the rest of the show. But I want to introduce our special guest here. We have Mr. Houston Spore, who is actually one of the employees of Project Opioid. He works as our Director of Community Relations. But he's here today to talk to Dr. Phil and I a little bit about his own personal experiences and how he wound up, what he went through and how he wound up with working with us today. So welcome, Houston.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, why don't you first start off and tell us a little bit about your experiences? Tell us about your experiences with substance use and your history and how you got to where we are.
Sure. Basically, to look at anything that I do now, I have to look back at my past, obviously. And I grew up in DeLand, Florida. Grew up 2 wonderful parents. My father was a physician. My mom was a lobbyist. I would say, growing up, I didn't have any big changes probably up until my parents' divorce. And that was probably the biggest thing that hit me at that point at around age 11. After that point, I started feeling very just off. I didn't feel good about myself. I started dealing with depression at a young age, started dealing with anxiety. And to combat it when I was that young, really, I played sports. That's kind of what I did. Played basketball every day. Did everything I could to just get out of my head and not feel what I was feeling. When it wasn't sports, though, it soon became alcohol when I was a little bit older, and fell into some other drugs with the friend groups because it helped me stop feeling. The issue is I started young. I was experimental by age 13, 14. I was using, hallucinogens. And then by age 15, I'd already taken my first opioid with my first knee surgery. And by 16, I'd had my first major back surgery. So it was subsequent years of a lot of drug use that led into my use of Oxycontin. This is back in the 90s, late 90s, right about there, where they were giving Oxycontin out pretty heavily for any chronic pain issue. I was dealing with 3 herniated discs in my spine, surgery coming up, and I was given 40 milligram Oxycontin twice a day. There was no, hey, watch out for this or watch out for that. It was take care of your pain, and so I did. And I thought passing out made sense. I mean, that's what you're supposed to do, right? But it just, no one ever told me it was wrong. So by age 16, I had my first back surgery. I came back. This is in my formative years playing high school basketball, trying to get back to school, still trying to get a scholarship for sports. And I injured my back again. By age 22, I'd already gone through now 4 spine surgeries, 2 knee surgeries, and 16 broken bones. I was very hard on my body. By then, they started utilizing Oxycontin and oxycodone. You had one for breakthrough pain and one through chronic pain, and it really, it zaps your view of the world. I became very addicted pretty soon after I had my spinal fusion. And that's when everything, I say probably about 24 is when everything fell apart for me. I became very depressed, agoraphobic. I couldn't leave the house. I couldn't leave without using. That was the first time I really kind of realized I had an issue, and I'd gone to my father and I explained what I was feeling, and I went to treatment. I've been to 4 treatments. The first 3 I sought out, but I was feeling just terrible. Every time I went in, it was the best intentions, but it just wasn't the right time. And as I got older, the drug use became more rampant. I'd get out of rehab, I'd do well for a couple months, but I was just never satisfied with the way I was feeling. I guess I wanted instant gratification, and recovery is not that. It's not instant, and it's not easy, And so what I found is that going into probably about 2012, 13, I was using all different types of opioids at this time. I was using intravenously, things I'd never thought I'd do. I was stealing, I was doing things that literally went against all my moral fiber. And probably the thing that changed my life at that point that leads me here today is I lost my father to a heart attack. And we were very close. And my family soon after Marchman acted me, Stuart Marchman Act, and I was sent to treatment. But it was a time when I thought I was going to die. I don't think I really cared if I lived or died at that point. My usage was out of control. I had lost a lot of friends by then. I had lost people who were close to me, and my way of dealing with it was not dealing with it. And losing my father was probably the one where I go, he didn't see me sober. I wish he could have, but it was going to be my chance to at least, in his memory, live a good life. And that's what turned it around. So after spending about a year in treatment, this is around 2015, I got out and decided that I was going to dedicate everything that I could do to start helping other people, because it made no sense. I've lost so much of my friends' lives, and I see all these parents that lose their children young, and it was just time. I began working at Livestream in Lake County, worked there, and then Dr. Ward, you talked to me about Project Opioid, and I was lucky enough to come over because the vision and everything that goes on with Project Opioid, and being able to help people at a different level, from a policy level, from all different facets. And it truly has been an amazing trip. I would not have changed anything, because it definitely has given me a perspective on life that I don't think I would have had. But I definitely appreciate the journey, for sure.
Houston, thank you so much for sharing that incredible story. And it's one I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with.
Absolutely.
The ups and downs and the struggles. Before I have a question for you, but before I do that, I'd like to explain the Marchman Act so that people know what that is. That's an involuntary placement for evaluation of a substance use disorder first. So that evaluation is, family members can go down to court and present the case of their loved one who's using and they fear is going to lose their life as a direct result of the substance use disorder. And the judge, if they believe there's enough information that supports that, can actually order the individual for an assessment first. And then they go to a place like Spore Health Partners that will do that assessment and then make recommendations to the court about if they need treatment, and if they do need treatment, what level of treatment they may need, whether that's residential treatment or outpatient treatment, medication-assisted treatment, et cetera. And then from there, then they're court ordered to treatment for a period of time and hopefully move through that recovery process and that treatment process, much like you described, Houston. I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear from you the kinds of things that might have been helpful for you. I hear 13, 14, 15 experimenting, using drugs. Obviously, the drug use escalated into even more powerful substances, more addicting substances. What along your journey might have been helpful to you, particularly in those adolescent years, late adolescent years, early adult years, that may have helped move you a little more quickly through that recovery process, that treatment process?
I think education. I think that first time you go to take a pill, you understand the what you're getting yourself into. The possibilities that this is a substance that has a very high addictive quality, and what that looks like. That never came up. I think back through the years, I don't think that happened maybe once or twice. And that's when, and more so when pain management became bigger. Pain management doctors would talk about the addictive nature, but not when I was not in those formative years by any stretch of imagination. Probably the education portion, and then bringing family in on those type of decisions, especially when I'm a 16-year-old. They help make decisions, but I like I said, my father's a physician, but I think the lack of education, even on his side at that point, and the ramifications of some of these drugs, would have helped. We could have made a decision together. Here my father was wanting me not to hurt. I mean, he's gonna, of course, give him something for pain. Can't tell you how many times I saw my father and my mom cry when I'm, just in tons of pain. It's tough. So having somebody, a third party come in and be able to help you in that position, and not make it emotional, would be very, very helpful for sure.
I think that's a great point. This is one of the few chronic diseases that really impacts the family so much. And Houston and I have actually known each other for pretty much our entire lives. And I'm very close with his family. So I saw firsthand some of the impact that this has had on them. So Houston, what would you say to someone who's listening right now, who has a son, who has a brother-in-law, who is in the same situation you were 5 years ago? What advice would you give them?
You don't want to lose your chance to have that conversation and talk and be the one that possibly could get your brother, get your loved one, whatever that is, into treatment, or at least get them evaluated. And I had a lot of uncomfortable conversations growing up with my family, and thank God I did. I mean, because if you just say, well, that's your life, that's how they're going to do it, and you do this completely, hands-off approach, I would have died. There's no doubt in my mind. I say this, more so now than ever, I would have died if my family would not have intervened at that period of time. I was dying, addiction to slow suicide. And I was moving fastly towards that end result. And to have the conversation and be able to do it and have it on multiple occasions until you get to the point where there's no other thing but to Marchman Act your family, I guess. Using those is not a means of telling your loved one you don't love them. It's telling them, I love you this much, I'm willing to sever our relationship. Okay, because otherwise that person's life is going to be severed from everybody's. And I think that's the hardest part for people. It's grappling between the relationship and those scared of blurring those lines.
So you're making an excellent point, is that tug of war between the parent who recognizes something's happening to my child, whether an adolescent or an adult child, because we're not immune from becoming
Right.
dependent as adults, and parents having to intervene with their adult children, or siblings have to intervene, with their adult siblings. And the tug of war of, I don't want to create more pain and discomfort. Maybe I don't know what I'm looking at. I'm afraid of what the reaction's going to be. And then the side of on your side, the person who's using, to be angry with the loved one who's intervening. I really like the fact that you said continuously have this conversation, repeat this conversation, move into that area where you can address it on a regular basis until the loved one that's using hears that message of love and support. Having said that, I'm sure there's many of our listeners out there thinking, that's me right now.
Right.
I'm at that point. I'm a parent and I don't know what to do. What might be some guidance that you might give them from the perspective of someone who heard that story, that heard that plea from a parent, that might be helpful to those that are listening, to say, step out in there and do it?
It's it was the 30th conversation is when finally something stuck in. You know what I mean? And probably some other word stuck in those other conversations as well. But it's to, and I hate being redundant, it's the simplest thing is to talk to your kids about the most simple things, right? You gotta talk to your kid about everyday life. But when it comes to substances, due to the stigma and everything else surrounded by it, it's a disease. What you're dealing with is a disease. What you're going through can be helped. Okay, that you don't have to fight this alone. I'm here for you, and other people are here for you. You know, let us help you get to that next step. Let us help you get to that next point, over where you can start seeing a little bit different, because this is what you're going through, and lay it out. Because if approaches aren't working, where you're trying to go at it from a parental only aspect, go at this. You're going through a disease. This is what happens. Would you not cure yourself if you had cancer? Would you not cure yourself if you had diabetes? Would you control it? What would you do? You know, try to relate to them on different levels. That helped with me. You know, those are the areas where it's like, okay, that makes sense. You know, it still didn't change the fact that I was, you know, I was in the depths of the disease. It did help make sense that we could find a common ground, you know, to say, all right, I do see what you're saying. Now, where do we go from here?
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. I recall, seeing how everything went down, and there's really a need to talk to, not just as a parent to a child, but as a friend to a friend, as or brother to brother, sister-in-law to brother. All of those people and all those relationships are so, so vital in working with someone who has an addiction, and making them understand, like you said, that this is not a moral failing. This is a disease. And that is such an important distinction, and really breaking that stigma. And, Houston, we talked about your history and how long you used, and it seems like it was a long time. And like I said, I was there for some of it. But how would it be different if you were struggling now versus struggling earlier in the early 2000s?
So say I started, and I'd be now I was using for 15 years, somewhere around there. And now, though, the substances out there now would, obviously, overdoses happened. I lost people, but there wasn't this feeling on the street of, you didn't know what you were getting. You know, it was the pills. It was oxycodone, 30 milligrams. It was Dilaudid. But the point is that you weren't seeing what you're seeing now with pressed pills, with the fentanyl. And then when the pills stopped, now when the pills left, and heroin comes in, then the fentanyl came in behind it. I mean, it's killing people at record pace. Like I say this, and Kendall, you and I've discussed this even on a personal level. I'd be dead. I'd be dead.
Yeah.
My usage was that type of usage, and I'd say if you're at the point where you want to get help now, because you're in a more dire time to actually ask for help, because the chances are a lot slimmer that you make it out of this era of drug use, for sure. That's definitely what I see. And that's what I see. I still see the people that are still out there using, people that were, former friends of mine that are still out there. And like I said, I've lost quite a few of them.
Earlier, you made an important point about the kind of the pieces of the puzzle coming together for me to finally see the picture and to recognize that I really suffered with substance use disorder, and I needed help. I heard 4 times in treatment, 3 times you came out and did pretty well for a while, and then fairly quickly slipped back into use. I know our listeners are also feeling at times that they're struggling, and I think I got a handle on this. I think I've rounded the corner. I'm going to be okay. And then boom, they relapse again. Something else has come up, or they struggle, or a new situation, or an old situation triggers use again. Could you speak to that from your perspective on your journey towards recovery, to say, how should I feel when I relapse? What are some steps that I might be able to take when I relapse? Your key to getting help when you need it is really important, because the overdose epidemic, is, you never know when that overdose is going to come. And so getting help when you need it is important. What words of wisdom might you provide to those who are really struggling on that journey?
That each relapse, you can learn something, and the shame that comes with it, I understand, but the shame will only drag you back into another relapse. And those are some of the hardest times I had to dig myself out of. But the ones I had to dig myself out of, instead of trying to go to my support groups and all those other people that were trying to help me, were the hardest times. Right now, I'm almost 5 years into this, right? And so of not using, and during this pandemic, it has been very, very trying. Some of those supports that I used to utilize aren't necessarily easy to get to. I would say make more time to take care of yourself if you're in recovery at this point. If you did relapse and you need help, reach out, call Aspire, do those things that you would have done if you were in the pandemic. It's I know it's not easy, but it definitely is worth it. What I've gained on this side of it is learning that if you ever feel like you have addiction figured out, then you're coming up to a relapse. And that's the way I look at it, because it is something that is it's a disease that is cunning. It'll find its way. It's insidious. And you just have to be very cognizant of your surroundings and the way that you're handling yourself. And usually signs are popping up that a relapse is coming up, so just to take time for yourself and give yourself a overall, once over a check to see how you're doing mentally and physically, all of it, spiritually, all of it.
I think, that's great advice. And I think that's something that all of our listeners can really take to heart. Whether or not you're struggling with addiction, you're at risk for overdose, now's the time to do a check of yourself. It's been a hard year, y'all. I mean, it has been hard on everyone, whether you have an addiction issue or not. It's time to evaluate yourself physically, mentally, spiritually, and make sure that you're taking care of yourself, right? So, I mean, it's in Dr. Phil. I mean, what can people do?
Well, really important point that Houston's making is that self-care.
Exactly.
And before the pandemic, lives were busy, work kept us busy, other things kept us busy. And so we probably tended to not do that self-care very well, or as frequently as we ought to. Having to dig deep, for the resilience during the pandemic. The things that Houston talked about that you could do before the pandemic, are a little bit more difficult to reach out to. But finding new and different ways to experience those same supports. So it may be a FaceTime meeting, a Zoom meeting with your loved ones that live in California that can't visit you, to come to Disney World, et cetera. So really finding new and different ways to express those supports and being creative. And learning to kind of adapt. Those who live alone have a little bit more difficult time because there's not someone in the same household. But it's also been taxing on relationships.
Absolutely.
So when you are in the same household and you quarantine for a number of different weeks and months and now nearly a year,
right?
That can be a lot of friction. So finding new ways to communicate and really benefiting from that in a positive way, and also cutting ourselves a lot of slack.
Yeah.
To say, let me break away from this and
that grace, right?
Absolutely.
Giving ourselves and our loved ones grace in this time as we all kind of figure out how to move forward into 2021. So Dr. Phil, can you tell us again if we feel like we are at risk for overdose, if we feel like we're struggling, a loved one is, how do we reach out to Aspire?
Well, the key is really immediacy. So reaching out right away. Aspire Health Partners, we respond to our phone, 407-875-3700. Hit number 3 and you'll get directly to our access center if you're a new client seeking services or family members seeking information, but do it immediately. That immediacy is really key. Houston keeps talking about getting help when you need it, recognizing that now is the moment, because the next moment you may drift away from that and not feel that you need to. So in that moment, so a loved one, a family member, you reach out, speak the words that need to be spoken, get the information that you need, do it now. And that hope piece that Houston's talking about, 3-4 elements of treatment, and moving through that. And I really like that point. It's a really important point for our listeners to hear that Houston made, which is just when you think you got a handle, then you know that you're heading for a potential slip or relapse, because it is a chronic progressive disease, a brain disease. And so it needs to be tended to. I like to not rather think of recovery, but I like to think of managing your disease. We would do that with diabetes. We would do that with cancer. We would do that with, high blood pressure. We do that with cardiovascular disease. Manage the illness because it is cunning, and it will come back. given the opportunity.
Right. And we've seen that happen more and more during the pandemic, especially as people were quarantined and separated from their loved ones and from the resources that they need. So, well, thank you very much, Houston, for joining us today. And a very special thanks to my co-host, Dr. Phil. And so I just want to reiterate to all of our listeners that are listening right now that if you have a story like Houston's, if you feel as though you're struggling, if you are at risk for overdose, please reach out. Your community, your faith leaders, your business leaders, they care about you. And this is a disease, as we've discussed. Reach out to Aspire Health Partners, go to the Project Opioid website. There are resources available for you there. And we just encourage you to reach out and remember that you are loved by your community and you're not alone. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.